Queen Elizabeth I, later known as the Virgin Queen, was born on September 7, 1533, inside the royal palace at Greenwich, near London. She was the daughter of King Henry VIII of England, a monarch whose personal desires would forever alter the course of English history. Elizabeth's mother was Anne Boleyn, Henry's second wife, whose marriage to the king had already caused a religious and political earthquake. To marry Anne, Henry had broken England away from the authority of the Pope, establishing himself as the supreme head of the Church of England. This dramatic act was driven by one simple obsession: Henry's need for a legitimate male heir. When Elizabeth was born, bells rang and cannons fired, but the celebration was hollow. England had hoped for a prince, and Boleyn had promised a son. Instead, she delivered a daughter. Though Elizabeth was legally declared heir to the throne, replacing her older half-sister Mary, everyone at court understood the truth. Her position was fragile. Her worth depended entirely on whether her mother could give the king a son. From the beginning, Elizabeth's life was shaped by fear and uncertainty. At just a few months old, she was sent away from her parents and placed in her own household. While this was common for royal children, Elizabeth's separation was unusually cold. Her future depended not on affection, but on survival within the brutal politics of the Tudor court. And Boleyn's failure to produce a male heir sealed her fate. In 1536, after a series of miscarriages, Anne was arrested. She was accused of adultery, incest, and treason, charges now widely believed to have been invented to clear the way for Henry's next marriage. And Boleyn was executed at the Tower of London when Elizabeth was just 2 years old. With her mother's death, Elizabeth's world collapsed overnight. Her parents' marriage was declared invalid. Elizabeth was officially branded a bastard. Her royal title was stripped away, and her status reduced to that of an unwanted child whose very existence reminded the king of a failed marriage. Her household was downsized. Her servants went unpaid. Even basic clothing and food were denied without special permission. Elizabeth learned her first lesson early: royal blood did not guarantee safety. Henry VIII quickly remarried, and England soon celebrated the birth of a male heir, Prince Edward, in 1537. With a son secured, Henry's attitude softened. Elizabeth and her half-sister Mary were gradually allowed back into court life, though neither was fully trusted. Elizabeth's childhood became a strange balance between neglect and privilege. She did not enjoy a mother's love, but she received one of the finest educations available in Europe. Tutors trained her in Latin, Greek, French, Italian, and Spanish. She studied philosophy, theology, rhetoric, and history. This education was not designed to prepare her to rule. It was meant to make her useful, obedient, and harmless. But Elizabeth absorbed knowledge differently. She learned how power worked. She learned that words could be weapons. And most importantly, she learned when to remain silent. Among Henry's many wives, one woman left a lasting mark on Elizabeth: Catherine Parr, the king's final queen. Intelligent and compassionate, Catherine encouraged Elizabeth's education and restored her and Mary to the line of succession through Parliament. Yet tragedy remained a constant presence. Elizabeth watched two of her stepmothers lose their heads on the execution block. From this, she learned a lesson that would shape her entire life. Marriage could be fatal. When Henry VIII died in 1547, Elizabeth was only 13 years old. His son Edward VI became king, and England entered another period of instability. Elizabeth moved into the household of Catherine Parr, now remarried to the ambitious Thomas Seymour. What followed was one of the most disturbing episodes of Elizabeth's youth. Seymour showed inappropriate interest in the teenage princess, entering her chambers early in the morning, touching her, and encouraging dangerous familiarity. When these actions became public, Elizabeth was interrogated aggressively. She denied wrongdoing with remarkable composure. Her answers were cautious, precise, and disciplined. She survived, but she never forgot. From this moment onward, Elizabeth understood that male ambition was dangerous and that her body, as much as her bloodline, could be used against her. By the early 1550s, Elizabeth Tudor had mastered the art of survival. She dressed modestly, spoke carefully, and avoided taking clear political positions. In a court where a careless sentence could lead to execution, Elizabeth learned that silence was often safer than honesty. When King Edward VI fell gravely ill in 1553, England faced another succession crisis. Edward, a committed Protestant, feared that his Catholic half-sister Mary would undo the religious reforms of his reign. Under pressure from powerful advisors, Edward attempted to exclude both Mary and Elizabeth from the line of succession, naming Lady Jane Grey as his heir. Elizabeth understood the danger immediately. Rather than resist, she outwardly supported Mary's claim. When Mary marched on London, Elizabeth rode beside her sister in a public display of loyalty. Jane Grey was quickly removed, and Mary was crowned queen. At first, Mary treated Elizabeth with caution rather than hostility. But religious differences soon turned Elizabeth into a symbol of opposition. Protestants across England viewed Elizabeth as their future hope, while foreign powers saw her as a tool to destabilize Mary's rule. Elizabeth did nothing to encourage rebellion, but suspicion followed her everywhere. In 1554, England erupted in rebellion. The Wyatt Rebellion, sparked by opposition to Mary's planned marriage to the Spanish Prince Philip, quickly spread. Though no solid evidence connected Elizabeth to the uprising, Mary's advisors were convinced she was involved. Elizabeth was arrested and sent to the Tower of London. As she entered the fortress, she was taken through the same gate her mother had passed before her execution. Elizabeth believed she was about to die. She wrote letters proclaiming her innocence, knowing they might be her final words. For weeks, she was interrogated. She answered every question with careful precision, admitting nothing, denying nothing. Her self-control impressed even her enemies. With no proof of treason, Mary hesitated. Executing Elizabeth would make her a martyr and potentially ignite further rebellion. Instead, Elizabeth was released from the tower and placed under house arrest. She survived again. Mary I ruled for only 5 years. Her reign was marked by religious persecution, economic decline, and personal tragedy. When she died in November 1558, England was exhausted. Elizabeth was 25 years old when she became queen. Her accession was greeted with relief and celebration. But Elizabeth understood the reality of her inheritance. England was deeply divided by religion, nearly bankrupt, and surrounded by hostile Catholic powers. Elizabeth moved slowly. Rather than imposing extreme change, she pursued balance. Her religious settlement re-established Protestant doctrine while retaining familiar Catholic traditions. This compromise calmed the population and avoided the bloody religious wars raging across Europe. Elizabeth ruled not as a tyrant, but as a strategist. She relied on trusted advisors, especially William Cecil, who helped stabilize the economy, restore the nation's finances, and rebuild confidence in government. Almost immediately, pressure mounted for Elizabeth to marry. Foreign princes, English nobles, and members of parliament all demanded an heir. Elizabeth resisted. She entertained marriage negotiations as diplomatic tools, using them to delay conflict and gain political advantage. But she never committed herself, whether driven by childhood trauma, political calculation, or personal choice. Elizabeth refused to place her power in the hands of a husband. Instead, she crafted a powerful image, the Virgin Queen, married only to England. This identity strengthened her authority. Her unmarried status allowed her to rule independently, free from foreign influence or domestic rivals. Elizabeth's greatest threat came not from rebellion, but from blood. Mary, Queen of Scots, was Elizabeth's cousin and a Catholic with a strong claim to the English throne. Young, charismatic, and politically reckless, Mary's presence became a rallying point for Catholic plots. When Mary fled Scotland in 1568 and sought refuge in England, Elizabeth faced a dilemma. Killing her cousin would provoke outrage. Releasing her would invite rebellion. Elizabeth chose imprisonment. For nearly 20 years, Mary was held under guard while plot after plot unfolded in her name. Elizabeth resisted calls for execution, fully aware of the precedent it would set. But in 1586, Mary was directly implicated in a conspiracy to assassinate Elizabeth. This time, Elizabeth could not ignore the threat. Mary, Queen of Scots, was executed in 1587. Elizabeth claimed the order had been carried out without her consent, but few believed her. The decision haunted her. She had spent her life avoiding bloodshed within her own family, and now she had crossed that line. The consequences were immediate. Spain, led by King Philip II, declared war. In 1588, the greatest naval force Europe had ever seen sailed toward England. The Spanish Armada was meant to overthrow Elizabeth and restore Catholic rule. But English ships were faster, their commanders more flexible, and their tactics more innovative. Fire ships broke the Armada's formation, while storms battered the Spanish fleet as it retreated. Elizabeth addressed her troops at Tilbury with words that echoed through history, declaring that though she had the body of a weak woman, she possessed the heart and stomach of a king. The Armada was defeated. England emerged not just victorious, but transformed. Elizabeth became a living symbol of national resistance and divine favor. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 marked the peak of Elizabeth's reign. Across England, church bells rang, bonfires were lit, and the Queen was celebrated as the savior of the nation. Yet victory brought new burdens. War with Spain did not end with the Armada's failure. It dragged on for years, draining England's treasury and stretching its resources. Elizabeth, once careful with money, was forced to raise taxes and rely on loans. Popularity began to fade as economic hardship spread. At the same time, England faced unrest closer to home. Ireland and rebellion. Ireland remained one of Elizabeth's greatest challenges. English rule there was deeply resented, and rebellion was constant. The most serious uprising came in the 1590s, led by Hugh O'Neill, Earl of Tyrone. The war in Ireland was brutal and costly. English forces struggled, and reports of atrocities shocked even Elizabeth's advisors. Despite her reluctance, Elizabeth approved harsh measures, believing that failure would invite foreign intervention. The conflict dragged on for years and was still unresolved when Elizabeth died. It would become one of the most damaging legacies of her reign. As Elizabeth grew older, the people she trusted most began to disappear. William Cecil, her most loyal advisor, died in 1598. His son Robert Cecil took his place, but the loss deeply affected the Queen. Many of her longtime companions were gone, leaving Elizabeth increasingly isolated. Her reliance shifted to younger courtiers, most notably Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex. Charismatic but impulsive, Essex believed he could dominate Elizabeth's favor. Instead, he underestimated her. When Essex failed disastrously in Ireland and later attempted a rebellion in London, Elizabeth had no choice. In 1601, the man she once loved like a son was executed for treason. It was one of the most painful decisions of her life. By the turn of the 17th century, Elizabeth was visibly declining. Her health weakened, her hair thinned, and her famous energy faded. She dressed elaborately, using makeup and jewels to preserve the image of eternal youth. But the illusion could not last forever. The Queen who once danced for hours now struggled to stand. Yet even in old age, Elizabeth refused to surrender authority. She continued to attend council meetings, review documents, and make final decisions herself. One issue haunted her above all others: succession. Elizabeth had never named an heir. Doing so, she believed, would invite conspiracy and weaken her rule. But as her strength failed, the question became unavoidable. Quietly, arrangements were made. In March 1603, Elizabeth fell gravely ill. She refused to lie in bed, believing it symbolized death. For days, she remained upright, silent, and withdrawn. When asked about her successor, she finally gave a subtle sign of consent. The crown would pass to James VI of Scotland, the son of Mary, Queen of Scots. On March 24, 1603, Queen Elizabeth I died at Richmond Palace. She was 69 years old and had ruled England for 44 years, one of the longest reigns in English history. The Virgin Queen was gone. Elizabeth was buried in Westminster Abbey, placed in the same tomb as her half-sister Mary. In death, the rivals were united, a symbol of the turbulent century they had shaped. Her reign transformed England. Queen Elizabeth I, later known as the Virgin Queen, was born on September 7, 1533, inside the royal palace at Greenwich, near London. She was the daughter of King Henry VIII of England, a monarch whose personal desires would forever alter the course of English history. Elizabeth's mother was Anne Boleyn, Henry's second wife, whose marriage to the king had already caused a religious and political earthquake. To Mary and Henry had broken England away from the authority of the Pope, establishing himself as the supreme head of the Church of England. This dramatic act was driven by one simple obsession: Henry's need for a legitimate male heir. When Elizabeth was born, bells rang and cannons fired, but the celebration was hollow. England had hoped for a prince, and Boleyn had promised a son. Instead, she delivered a daughter. Though Elizabeth was legally declared heir to the throne, replacing her older half-sister Mary, everyone at court understood the truth. Her position was fragile. Her worth depended entirely on whether her mother could give the king a son. From the beginning, Elizabeth's life was shaped by fear and uncertainty. At just a few months old, she was sent away from her parents and placed in her own household. While this was common for royal children, Elizabeth's separation was unusually cold. Her future depended not on affection, but on survival within the brutal politics of the Tudor court. And Boleyn's failure to produce a male heir sealed her fate. In 1536, after a series of miscarriages, Anne was arrested. She was accused of adultery, incest, and treason, charges now widely believed to have been invented to clear the way for Henry's next marriage. And Boleyn was executed at the Tower of London when Elizabeth was just 2 years old. With her mother's death, Elizabeth's world collapsed overnight. She left behind a nation that was stronger, more stable, and firmly Protestant. England had emerged as a major naval power. Exploration had expanded its horizons. Literature, theater, and national identity had flourished. Yet Elizabeth's legacy was not without contradictions. She avoided war, yet fought devastating conflicts. She promoted unity, yet ruled through fear and control. She refused marriage, yet used it as a political weapon. She loved her people, but demanded absolute loyalty. The shadow of Anne Boleyn. Elizabeth never publicly acknowledged her mother, Anne Boleyn, but Anne's influence was undeniable. From her mother's execution, Elizabeth learned caution. From her mother's downfall, she learned independence. From her mother's fate, she learned never to surrender her power to a man. In many ways, Elizabeth's reign was shaped by a single childhood lesson: survival comes before sentiment. The Virgin Queen's legacy. Queen Elizabeth I remains one of history's most complex rulers. She was neither saint nor tyrant, but a woman navigating a world built to destroy her. She ruled through intelligence, patience, and an unbreakable will. She turned personal vulnerability into political strength, and she proved that a woman, ruling alone, could command a nation's loyalty for nearly half a century. When the Tudor dynasty ended with her death, England did not collapse, it endured. And that may be Elizabeth's greatest achievement.